First, let me introduce myself. I'm Emily Richmond, EWA's public editor, and today we're talking about the Supreme Court's decision making race-conscious college admissions no longer acceptable or allowed for post-secondary institutions in the United States. This is a seismic decision, although perhaps one that was not a huge surprise, but we want to talk with you about what happens next. And I can think of no one who's better to help lead that conversation for us than Bianca Quilantan of Politico. So I'm going to turn it over to Bianca in just a moment. If you have questions for our participants, and I hope that you do, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom on the right-hand side of your screen to add your question. We will get to those toward the end of our webinar presentation today. I will be relaying those to our participants. So if your question is for someone in particular, please indicate that. And again, you can add your questions at any point during the webinar, and we will get to them at the conclusion. Perhaps most importantly, this webinar is on the record. You are free to quote from it. We hope that you do. And if you have follow-up questions afterwards, you are free to contact any of our participants or speakers. So now I will turn it over to Bianca. Bianca.
Hi, thank you, everyone. Welcome. I'm happy to be moderating today's conversation about the Supreme Court's new ruling that will usher in a new era for college admissions. The court dealt a major blow to affirmative action in admissions, but stopped shortly of explicitly overturning more than 4 decades of precedent that has allowed colleges to narrowly consider race as a single factor in admissions decisions. As a quick reminder, these webinars are recorded and everything is considered on the record. We're going to cover the nuts and bolts of the ruling, what it means for post-secondary institutions and students right now, and how you can start thinking proactively now about your long-term approaches to covering the nuances and complexities of the court's decision. Now, let me introduce today's speakers. They are Melanie Gottlieb. She is the executive director of the American Colleges of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers, having joined the national office after nearly 2 decades in the field. And Zakiya Smith-Ellis is a principal at Education Council in Washington, D.C. She held the role of chief policy advisor to Governor Phil Murphy and previously served as New Jersey's Secretary of Higher Education. So yesterday was the ruling. It dropped, 10. We were all waiting for it. And again, as no surprise, it was a 6-3 ruling along ideological lines. And justices found that Harvard and the University of North Carolina's admissions programs, which are common across the country, discriminated against white and Asian American applicants. So my first question for both of you is, there was so much speculation of how far this ruling would go, what would mean for admission cycles. So what was the scope of this ruling?
So I think one thing that I'll note is that we are still going through all 200 plus pages of it to understand what the scope is and isn't. And I am not an attorney, but what I realize in working with many of them is that you ask one attorney something and you'll get one answer, you ask another and you get something else. So every college is going to have its own risk determination of what is out and what's in. Some colleges will feel better or more comfortable saying, you know what, I think this is the line and I'm going to go right up to it. And other colleges will say, I don't want to be anywhere near that. I'm afraid to be sued and will be far away. But no matter what, it's probably going to take us several weeks to really decipher and go through different pieces of the concurrence as well as the dissents to see where the majority of justices actually agreed on something. Because even when there's a ruling that has a majority ruling, the reasons why somebody, a justice, feels that way may be different. And so when you have something that's splintered in that way with different kinds of opinions, you actually have to go through each one to see what they say and where the majority of the court agrees.
Definitely. Melanie, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I really don't have much else to add to that because we are also going through the ruling very carefully and honestly working across higher education with our colleagues at Education Council and with other associations to ensure that we understand the scope. So I think that's still yet to be determined. It's not very clear at this point.
Definitely. Just kind of bouncing off of your expertise of being in the field and understanding like admissions, Melanie, I just kind of wanted to follow up. Yesterday, Ed Bloom kind of did threaten to sue or watch carefully colleges and their admissions practices. Is this something that you all are worried about? Maybe future litigation on the way you, consider admissions or change your practices?
So I think that as Zakia said, actually, she said it quite well, that every institution has its own sort of risk factor that and how they determine their practices. I think that every institution has been looking at their practices leading up to this decision. That was guidance that we gave prior to the decision, to take stock. Be clear about what your practices and processes are, so that when the decision comes down, you can then examine every aspect of your process and ensure that you are meeting the legal requirements. And so I don't think that I would say we are worried. I would say that we are carefully considering admission models and practices to ensure that they're meeting the requirements of the law. And it's yet to be seen where institutions are going to fall in terms of the changes that they're going to make.
Definitely. And this one is for Zakia. How does this interplay with political backlash we've seen to, affirmative action initiatives in states, or even DEI that has been rebuked in several red states lately? I think you're muted.
I think that's a great question and point, and one just historical point that I would note, and us also preparing for what we expected was going to happen, a ruling along ideological lines, right? And I could have added more about kind of the fact that I obviously disagree with the ruling. Maybe it's not obvious, but I should say that disagree with the ruling. I spoke to many lawyers and attorneys who also disagree with the ruling on legal grounds, feeling like the court itself contradicted itself, the fact that it excluded military academies because they have a unique interest in diversity that can't be met otherwise. I think Harvard and UNC would say the same thing, which is why they were doing what they were doing, right? And many colleges would say, so even on its face, it's a bit, the emperor has no clothes. Ketanji Brown Jackson would say, let them eat cake. It doesn't hold together. Again, I'm not an attorney, but I know enough to see when you have one argument here and a similar argument there and they don't align, there's something missing. So again, we'll take some time to see what that really means. But historically, places that actually long ago outlawed affirmative action, and I put that in air quotes, and maybe we can talk about that terminology and why I actually don't really love it. And I see that we've used race conscious admissions as a bit more accurate here. But California and Michigan, for instance, are two of the pioneer states for DEI initiatives. They are places where, because explicitly they couldn't use race in the admissions process, they said, well, we want to make sure that our campuses are campuses where people feel welcome from all backgrounds, where we do a lot more to recruit students of color. Now, again, how far have those initiatives gone? You can look at the data and see that Black and Latino student enrollment at some UCs, not all of them, but some UC system schools have not gotten back to where they were pre-Proposition 209. And University of Michigan is not as diverse as it was before its change as well. But there's no doubt that they have some of the strongest DEI programming in the nation that has served as a model for others. And that was born out of a realization that we needed to, or they needed to look at other options. I think it's no coincidence that the political movement that is behind this, the plaintiffs here who were suing SFFA, the Students for Fair Admissions, and the folks that are pushing the anti-DEI laws and bills, it's coming from the same place. It's the same kind of ideological piece, and it's a political one. This is not a legal, well-justified like legal argument. This is a political argument, and it's a political attack, and it's coming from the same place. So that's a long way of saying that institutions in states that have this backlash, that might be a place where you would normally go. You would bolster your DEI efforts because you may not be able to do this anywhere. And they will have to be more creative about how they continue to pursue their diversity and equity interests in the wake of this ruling. I will also note there are ways to do that, and I hope we can talk about that. This is not all is lost. Oh my goodness, there's nothing to be done. There are tons of things, and perhaps things that we have long eschewed or things that institutions maybe have shied away from in terms of being more aggressive about recruitment, more aggressive about looking at what constitutes merit and how it is defined, that will be pushed to the forefront in the wake of this decision.
Yeah, and that's definitely a question I'm going to ask you a little bit later. Yeah, Melanie, what else are we missing here?
No, I was actually just going to follow up with some comments about some of those practices, but if you're going to ask that a little later, I will hold my
Well, we're
comments.
hopping right into it right now.
All right.
I just, yesterday, maybe like other national reporters, my inbox was flooded with like press releases, everything. And the common trend that I saw was, people are wanting to go after the practice of legacy admissions or SAT requirements. So that's the first step of like, and things that I'd love to learn about. Is this something that, maybe we're considering more lawsuits on or changes to those practices?
So I'll step in and say that those practices in many cases have been evolving. So the idea that, the SAT scores are the be all and end all of admissions, we've seen over the last 5 to 7 years, a decline in the use of those scores specifically post-pandemic in the test optional movement. And so I don't think that is lawsuit material per se. I think that institutions have a variety of means by which they assess admissions. And let's be clear that we're really talking about a very slim margin of higher education institutions. We're talking about the most elite and the most competitive institutions are the institutions that people really are paying attention to. We can't strip admissions officers of every tool that they might have in order to assess whether or not a learner is ready. And so they use a combination of a variety of tools. ACRO has long worked with institutions in processes around holistic admissions. Holistic admissions as a process looks at a variety of factors and allows an institution to craft a diverse class based on the needs of the learners that they have and the missions of their institutions and the preparation that they wish to give to learners for workforce needs. And so this question about the tools is a challenging one, but I think institutions are well prepared to move forward and strengthen the tools that they use without as much of attention on race.
Definitely. And I will say that the thing that stuck out to me most yesterday was just the reaction from Congress, right? I saw Bobby Scott at a press conference yesterday, and he equated legacy admissions to like grandfather clauses when it came to like voting rights early on, because, Black Americans at that point didn't have grandfathers that could vote before then, right? And so he's basically having the same argument for legacy admissions where, Black and brown students maybe aren't being admitted to Harvard as quickly or don't have that, you know what I mean? So that was interesting. And then also the pushback on these standardized tests that he says have been discriminatory barriers. And so Zakia, you're on the legal side, are these things that are conversations that are happening?
Certainly, those conversations, I'm seeing the same things, and we kind of see is particularly among the advocacy community and folks that deal with Congress, focusing in on those pieces, SAT scores and legacy admissions. But I think there's actually a broader set of tools that we can think about, including guaranteed admissions from community colleges. So for instance, if you're thinking about Rutgers, where I just left the state of New Jersey and it has a pretty robust transfer pipeline, it could think about how to expand that and make it clearer to students coming from community colleges. Princeton University, also in New Jersey, just started taking transfer students not too long ago as a way to expand. I also would just point out Melanie's piece that we are so focused on a very small, like there's thousands of institutions of higher education in the nation. Most people that have college degrees in this nation do not go to one of these few hundred institutions. And I think we can also be talking about at the same time how to have a Supreme Court that doesn't have people that all went to the same couple of colleges or law schools when there's such a broader, so like this is not just about like how do we continue to have the elite colleges be the elite colleges and make them more diverse. That is important because we know that they continue to play a role, but it should also be a conversation about how do we as a society think about what constitutes merit and who is capable and who is deserving and who has talent. And I know for sure that talent is not limited to that set of institutions, and people that are capable of contributing to society and to conversation and to the halls of Congress and to the presidency and to the Supreme Court are not limited to folks that attended those institutions. As wonderful as they are, and I have attended some of them, and I think they should be much more diverse. So that is a separate piece that I think folks will also start to look at. The other piece, though, again, let's just talk about beyond legacy admissions and test scores, which are two things that I think are easy targets and will definitely be looked at. Early decision policies, folks will look at early decision and see. It really does mean that each institution, though, is going to need to look at what are the policies I have in place, who uses them, and what is the outcome from when you have these policies? So if I have a legacy program, is that legacy program yielding more white students? Is it yielding more diverse students? Do I have it in a way that, like, that's the question you need to ask. If I have an early decision program, if I have a financial aid program, what am I doing to create scholarships and share about those scholarships in places where students may be scared off from applying because of the cost of college? There are many places where people have talent, but they're not really encouraged to apply to some of these institutions, even if they have very robust financial aid, because you don't know that until you go through the whole process. So being more transparent about what aid is available early on, thinking about pipeline and pathways programs for students as early as middle school to help them understand how do I get to college? How do I get to not just selective college, but what is the pathway for me? California, again, was a pioneer in helping students in middle school and high school understand you take these A through Gs and you can get admission to these kinds of institutions. It's a very clear system. Again, all has its flaws, right? Everything has its flaws, but these are things that are born out of a need to be more expansive at how we look at these things. So I would say, I could go on and on. Recruitment. Every D1 college that has a football or basketball program seems to have no problem finding highly talented and capable Black men with very unique skills. They will go to the ends of the earth to find these folks in small towns where they can only recruit one. So I know that talent is out there in a variety of different ways, but we have to be thoughtful and really put in the resources because it takes a lot of resources to do that kind of recruitment, to find talent where it may be across the nation.
Yeah, and Melanie, what strategies are universities or admissions officers mulling right now to ensure that they're enrolling or recruiting a diverse freshman class?
When you're seeking to diversify a class, you have to define diversity in a multitude of ways. We tend to be very focused on racial diversity. And a better way to approach it is to think about diversity writ large and to seek talent and provide opportunity. ACRA's been very committed to training our professionals to provide access pathways. We look at, in a recruitment area, we're looking at things like first generation status. We're looking at strengthening scholarship programs to provide more opportunity. There's a lot of focus, as we know from today, on student debt. If programs that will ensure that learners can come to institutions and not have to take out a lot of student loans and leave with great student debt, those are programs that are going to deepen opportunity, and those deepening opportunities go beyond race. We're looking at socioeconomic status. We're looking at all kinds of diversity, and institutions have those tools to do that. But as Zakia said, it is very resource intensive. And that's one of the challenges that we're going to see in an environment where higher education costs are rising. We are going to have to spend more in order to ensure we have equity of opportunity. That's a reality that institutions are going to have to face and balance as they move forward to try to meet their missions and have diverse classes.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's always been, since these cases have been floating, but we saw that California has struggled to, enroll the same level of diversity without affirmative action. Same with, 8 other states since they decided to not pursue it. Could this decision be used by colleges as, a cover to maybe no longer prioritize diversity, or say that their hands are tied by this case to pursue it? What is the thinking on that?
I would just, I'll just share first from a philosophical standpoint. I think you will note that the majority of US higher education has come out in some way against this decision because they are committed to diversity. And so the idea that an institution might use this decision as a cover to no longer pursue diversity is implying that that diversity intention is not embedded in their philosophical approach and their missions. And I think that that would be a mistake to think of it in that way.
And I totally agree. I think most institutions care about diversity and know the value of it, including, and to Melody's point, there's all kinds of diversity. In this instance, the Supreme Court focused in on racial diversity, which is, and I understand why, but just interesting given, you know, an institution could decide, yes, I want to give an extra nudge to a violinist from Iowa, but I can't give an extra nudge to a Latino woman from Iowa who may have a unique experience growing up there as a Latino woman. You know, like that is where we are. Like that's where we are. And that is what is going to happen now. You're looking for diversity in all the ways, except for this one that is huge, that plays a huge role in how we experience life in America. And that's frankly not just, I think this is being portrayed as a loss for Black and Latino students. It's not just a loss for those students, it's a loss for all students. It's a loss for white students who will have fewer of racially diverse classmates to learn from. Their educational experience is frankly going to be lessened because they won't have that same level of diversity if institutions cannot figure out how to keep up their efforts. So I have every confidence that institutions, which are the vast majority of institutions that very much care about this as an element of their core educational mission. Part of what they do and what they see their role is helping people learn from folks that are not like them and in heterogeneous groups in different ways. Like that's kind of part of the secret sauce, right? Like that's why it's part of the academic piece, is to like bring people together that may not just be like the ones that you are familiar with or that are people that you grew up with, and putting them in a space where they're learning together, learning from one another and learning about different strengths. I could go on and on about the values of diversity, but there have been thousands of pages that wrote about that in the Supreme Court amici brief that seemingly were not, you know, in research pages, not just people thinking about the value, but like actually seeing the ways in which diverse groups actually lead to better outcomes.
Can I make one other comment to that? And that is, you know, we're really focusing on diversity in admissions and the diversity in the classroom and how that impacts classroom learning. But if you take that one step further, is that we're preparing our learners in our institutions, we're preparing them for the workforce. And the reality is that we live in a very diverse country. We live in a country where the growth in population is a diverse population growth. And so not only are we doing a disservice to our students of color and our white students by not having diverse classrooms, we're also doing a disservice to our national workforce as we move forward into the future. This is a fundamental problem. If institutions are looking to prepare learners to work and live and learn in a global diverse economy, we have to function in diverse classrooms. That's really how we're going to prepare our learners. And so I think it feels very short-sighted to be that focused on this sort of lack of diversity in the classroom. It's really going to be a problem moving forward for our country if we do not have diverse higher education.
And, you know, just a small follow-up for you, Melanie. There was a lot of talk about the essay, right? Especially during oral arguments and again in the opinion. And essentially, you know, Chief Justice John Roberts said that nothing in this case should be construed to prevent any student from, you know, telling their lived experiences through that essay. Do you think that an essay for college may have more weight now, you know, in the admissions process, even though it's only one tool that you use?
I think it's a little too early to say, because I think also that that same quote from Justice Roberts also cautioned the use of the essay as a placeholder. And so I don't think that we quite know how we should proceed yet. I think that the college essay and learners being able to share their lived experiences is a crucial tool for institutions to determine who to bring into their class, who is going to best contribute to the overall class, and who's going to best benefit from the opportunities. I think the essay is one of the tools that they can use to really get beyond the test score, to get beyond the grades on the transcript, and to understand the character of the student. And so I don't think it's going to go away, but it's going to be a question about how we proceed in a way within the legal constraints, because they're not clear right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And, here's my last question for you both, kind of more forward looking, even though I think our whole conversation has been pretty forward looking. There's this case that has been percolating through the courts. It is the Thomas Jefferson High School case, if you have all been following it. And just for our listeners who don't know, it's a case that is going against race neutral alternatives, which are safe largely by this opinion, or weren't touched by this opinion, I should say. Anyways, the school created a program that uses race neutral means to admit more underrepresented students, and it's being challenged by a group of parents who say that those policies are discriminating against their students. I'm wondering, are race neutral alternatives next? I know we're looking at those as a way to ensure diverse classes, but what is the outlook on this case?
Well, that one is also winding its way, as you mentioned, through the court. So we'll have to see exactly what they say. But one thing that we do know, just even from how this has been described previously and legal precedent, is that anything that is trying to be a proxy for race. So previously and I'm having some technical difficulties, I think, is that anything that is Sorry, can you hear me?
Now I can hear you. Yes, sorry.
Sorry, I don't know what happened there. Anything that is trying to be a proxy for race, right? If you have a legitimate interest in having a more geographically, not ethnically, but geographically or income-driven diversity, right? Like if that is your genuine interest and you say, you know what, we need to have more low-income students, we need to think about people from different areas, and that is a unique, genuine interest, that's fine. But if what you're trying to do is say, if we have an income thing that is this, because that's the average income of Latino students that we had before, and we have a wealth component that is this, because that's the average wealth. And so what we're really trying to get is still try to have about this many Latino students in our school, and this is another way to get them, and you're doing the you're just trying to find something that is literally a proxy one for one. That is really going to be risky. But if you are having a legitimate interest in race neutral alternatives for the sake of having different alternatives, we think that there's much more likely to be opportunity there.
Awesome. Well, that's all from me. Emily, what questions are we seeing so far?
Thank you very much, everyone. There's great questions already, so we are going to jump right into them. But I did have one, and that is Eric Hoover over at the Chronicle of Higher Education had an interesting piece saying it's time to officially retire the phrase affirmative action. And I was hoping, Zakia, you could weigh in on this.
Yeah, I think it's been time, because affirmative action, as people commonly think about it, and has not actually been instituted for at least 30 or 40 years, since 1978 Bakke. I feel like that is when that ended. What people think of, and when people are polled on affirmative action, they think this is a compensatory measure because of some past historical wrong that you are being given a benefit. And that isn't actually what colleges are doing right now. That hasn't really been fully legal for some time. And what they've been doing is saying everyone has passed some level of bar of competence to show that they can be successful in this institution of higher education. Among those folks, we need to build a class, and we have a unique interest in having that class be as diverse as possible, including racially. And so we are going to, in the same way I mentioned the violinist from Iowa, we might give a tip there. We also might give a tip to someone based on their race or ethnicity prior to this decision. And that is what has been happening. And that is what was at risk in these cases. And so there's just a different way that we need to describe it, because I don't think that is what most people think of when they think of affirmative action.
Thank you, Zakia. We have a great question. I'm going to jump right into them. One person is asking if we talked about the possibility of the plaintiffs said they were going to take on sort of a watchdog role and were prepared to challenge schools that don't fall in line. Do you expect the Department of Education to issue guidance on how institutions should come into line with the ruling?
I expect that they will. They usually do when these kinds of things happen. And every indication that we have from the comments of President Biden yesterday suggested that we'll be seeing something in the next couple of weeks, if not sooner.
Okay. And a question from Melanie, and this is a two-parter. The first is, will institutions have to alter the way they collect data related to race and ethnicity? I'm wondering if it's going to somehow be no longer kosher to actually keep that data or to share it with people. And then related to that, could institutions use data related to students' address, educational background, and household income as a proxy for race? Will that be satisfactory to the court?
In terms of the way institutions collect data, I think at the front end in admissions, that's the only place that we might have to examine. And I think it's too soon to know. We are just not certain what those requirements are going to be. I will say that institutions are required to report race and ethnicity data through iPads on enrolled students. So we have to have that data. That data is collected, that data, the government collects that. And that's a vital piece of information embedded into compliance reporting for Title IV funds. So that is, that's not going to go away. So it's a question about where that data will be collected. If an institution has to not collect it at the front end, that will actually add an additional burden to institutions and their ability to be compliant once the learner is enrolled. Because if you've got to then go out and collect that data again in a new way, that's just going to be a challenge. So we're not looking to do that. We hope that that's not the case, but it's really too soon to tell. In terms of using data related to home address, educational background, household income, those data sources are already being used by many institutions to target recruitment efforts. And so those are, they target neighborhoods, they target areas based on that. It's not a proxy for race. It's quite clear we can't use data as a proxy for race, but institutions use that kind of data in many cases to target recruitment efforts already.
Yeah, as
Thank
I mentioned
you.
earlier, you
Go
can't use
ahead. Yep.
yeah, you shouldn't use those things to say this is where all of your Black students live, and therefore we're just going to try to pick people. You need to have a unique interest that you want to have. Maybe you're University of Georgia and you want to be diverse in terms of where people come from in the state, and therefore you want to have folks from different zip codes. The other thing that I would just mention, I've seen a number of stories that say people can no longer check the box. It's not clear from the from the thing, and I know what they mean by that, but it's not clear that that is actually what the court said. In no place have I seen that they say you can't actually ask for the demographic information. What I think we may see is something like what many colleges do already around need blind admissions, where you do know what the income of someone is, but you decide that you're going to keep that from the admissions team so that they don't see that when they're making a decision. You could think of a similar way that race might be collected. And I will note there's actually a federal policy movement to collect more information on the front end about applicants, including their race and ethnicity. So if that were to become law, for instance, colleges would have to keep that information, even if they couldn't use it in the way that the Supreme Court has said is unlawful.
Thank you. A question from member Lisa Rowan. She's curious about the potential implications for graduate programs, which have been lucrative for some of the schools in her coverage area. For more competitive graduate programs, for example, a medical school, what's at stake here?
I think we believe this covers, undergraduate, graduate, there's no real, difference. It's hard to see how you could say that just because many of the previous Supreme Court cases, for instance, started out in graduate schools. The first one on this whole stream of things was from Bakke, I think was a medical school, University of Michigan Law School. So yes, graduate and undergraduate will be similar.
And then James Hill, this is slightly related to this. He's asking, are there schools that will not be impacted by the ruling? For example, are there schools outside of the military that can still use race-conscious recruitment?
I think it's too early to see. The only thing that I would just note in the framing of this, the idea, there was the court in its majority opinion seemed to suggest that someone's experience of race could be used in terms of how they have either overcome challenges or a source of pride. Maybe you say, I'm so proud of my heritage, and I think it contributes to who I am and how I've been able to be successful. And I would think I would add to that. They explicitly said that students could still use that students can still talk about that, and institutions can still use that part of their racial background and heritage in the admissions process. I think the question will be how you implement that without running afoul of the court, and that is definitely too early to tell.
Gemma Stevenson asks, the Supreme Court included that colleges and universities could consider when students talk about how race impacted their lives through, quote, discrimination, inspiration, or otherwise. I'm presuming that would be through a college application essay or perhaps in a face-to-face interview, if anybody's still doing those. Will that part of the ruling allow for colleges and universities to continue being, quote, race conscious, or is that less broad than it seems, that definition of discrimination, inspiration, or otherwise? Is that an open door? How open is that door? And I guess it might be too soon to know.
Yeah, I think that's the $64 million question, right?
Yeah, I think it's too soon to know, although I would say that in a holistic admissions process, a student will be those kinds of discrimination, inspiration, or otherwise can be considered from any particular race. And so those are character qualities and not necessarily race qualities. And so I think that those kinds of things are already being considered outside of race. So I think it's going to be too soon to see how that might alter that and what the practice actually looks like within legal confines.
Camille Phillips, reporting from the great state of Texas. Hi, Camille. She appreciates the need to talk about what tools to create diverse student body are still available, but the bottom line is there's evidence that any of these alternative tools are as effective at creating a racially diverse student body at selective universities other than race-conscious admissions. Again, she's asking if any have been shown to be as effective as race-conscious admissions. She was under the impression that nothing is as effective.
So I would say we haven't yet seen the evidence of absence is not the absence of evidence, whatever Donald Rumsfeld said, right? So what I believe is that we have not seen institutions really go as far as they could go. I don't know of institutions that have fully banned all other kinds of legacy preferences, early decision preferences, full scholarships for people from different income backgrounds that is totally transparent, complete reciprocity in terms of transfer. Like, again, I'm just throwing things out there that you could do. I don't know of any institution that has done all of those things to say, yep, it's totally impossible. So I think what we are now facing is a situation where we're going to need to try more things than we have in the past.
I'll just add that there are no elite institutions who have done those things.
That's totally, absolutely, yes, thank you, Melody.
Let's remember,
absolutely,
we're focusing on a very small margin of institutions, and there are lots of institutions out there who have very diverse classes, who provide lots of opportunities. We're really focusing on a slim margin.
I'm in Atlanta, where Georgia State University has increased their enrollment of Black students, and Black and Latino students graduate at the same rates as white and other students at the institution, which is something that most people haven't done. Other folks are learning from them about what they do to do that. So like, absolutely spot on.
Thank you. Next, we're going to turn to Howard Bloom from the Los Angeles Times. And he's said this has been somewhat covered, but any predictions on where the next legal challenges will be? What should reporters be watching for? Have you even heard any scuttlebutt or, gathered on the water cooler?
This is just so difficult to know. I mean, I saw Ed Bloom said he's going to be on the lookout or whatever. And I think that is just so I won't go off on like how litigious we are in American society right now and whatever, but that is like evidence of that. The idea that we're like trying to kind of find the next thing to sue a college on is challenging at best, but I'm not sure what it will be. I think we get a lot of frivolous lawsuits in the nation. And so who knows what may come from that. I don't know if Melanie, you've heard of anyone already that has their ears to the ground on something specific.
I haven't, but I was going to make a similar comment in that it's very frustrating to me that we are focusing in this sort of scarcity mindset sense. The country has a lot more challenges, and higher ed has a lot more challenges, and this feels like looking for the next lawsuit just feels like a lot of energy that could be better spent elsewhere on improving equitable outcomes for education.
Well, we should point out, and Bianca, what is the percentage around right now? Only 5% of the nation's college students go to these elite institutions. Is that about right? I think Bianca's frozen or she's on mute, but Melanie, is that right?
It's that high.
I think that's I think
feels
she's
high.
frozen, and I think that's about right. That's
Okay.
that's pretty close to right. And so it feels like we're spending a lot of time when we could be focusing on things that could have real impact on larger and create larger opportunities for more students.
Okay. I wanted to ask, this is a question that we have for reporters all the time, which is coming from James Hill, which is something that reporters should be sure to get right when writing stories about this case and its impact. Are there obvious red flags that reporters should avoid? That's a great question, James. Thank you.
I would avoid the saying that students can no longer check the box. I've heard that a couple of times, and that is just not something that I've seen from the cases thus far that says that that is the case. Like, you can't use race exclusively. It doesn't mean that students cannot, that colleges can't collect that information, or that students couldn't share that information explicitly. Colleges can't exclusively use race to make an admissions decision. And so that's one piece. I'm going to add on more than what the question asked, and that is the court made it seem as though colleges were doing that. And I actually think that's, again, part of the challenge with the decision, which is that's not what they were doing. It's not what they said that they were doing, but that is the perception of what's no longer allowed. And so we now need to figure out, what does that mean, given that they kind of ruled on a process that wasn't actually the process that institutions use. The other thing is the notion that this is primarily some benefit that was given to Black and Latino students. Again, affirmative action, air quotes, race conscious admissions benefited a variety of students, but the main legal argument was really that it promoted educational diversity for all students. So this is really a loss. I've been saying kind of tongue in cheek, but not really. This is a loss for white students. Like, if you're a student who was this, you're no longer going to get the same quality of education that you did before, because you don't have the brilliance of your students of color who may be from underrepresented backgrounds to learn from.
Thank you, Zakia. A question: how do you think this might impact financial aid, specifically for historically disadvantaged groups, based on potentially troubling or problematic judgments on, quote, merit? Do you see how this might have any impact on financial aid decisions?
I think it's too soon at this point to know. We're right now working hard to understand the impact on the admissions process, and I think financial aid will be next. But it's, at least as far as we're concerned, it's too soon for us to know.
Are there stories that you'd love to see reporters covering about this? Maybe not as the next day story tomorrow or the weekend, but maybe a little bit long term. Are there some places where reporters could drill down and focus that you'd like to see them cover?
I would love to see folks cover those places that have been successful at increasing the diversity of their student body and how they've done that. I would love to see stories of maybe non-elite institutions like Georgia State and other colleges that have closed those gaps, and show how well their students do in the workplace, and others, like what a quality education they receive, to kind of expand the scope and limit of what we think of as high quality education. But there are certainly, while there's not an institution that has had in that elite, highly selective set that has had affirmative action banned and then been able to come up to the same levels that they had before, there are a lot of institutions that have seen increases. And what did they do? What kind of recruitment did they do? Other policies that they've changed. I think there are many institutions that have been thinking more holistically and not just about race conscious admissions as a way to diversify, and hopefully more will be doing that. And so it'd be great to think about what are some of those systems changes that again are not just proxies for race, but that are legitimate interests that they have to increase their diversity of all kinds, that has the benefit, maybe a side effect of getting a more diverse student body. That would be fantastic.
I would say the plus one to that, but also I would love anything that's going to focus on the non-elite institutions. Because that's really where the majority of our learners are getting educated. That's where the majority of our future workforce is going to come from. And I would love to see some stories around the value of diversity, because I think there's this, again, sort of scarcity mindset around opportunity within this narrow, slim margin. And I think the value of diversity in many ways is being called into question. And I think that's short-sighted. So I really would love to see how that diversity, stories about how that diversity plays out in the classroom, in preparing learners for workforce, in contributing to excellent problem solving and decision making, and the skills and competencies that emerge from that.
Those are great story ideas. Thank you. Lynn Hatter and also another attendee have both asked about the same question, which is what are the potential impacts here for HBCUs and other institutions that are minority serving?
So I think again, we'll have to see exactly, but one of the things that many folks are predicting, and I could definitely see happening, is more of these students end up at those institutions, and they maybe not about just the Supreme Court cases, but one of the things that we are seeing as a trend is just because of some of these anti-DEI pushes, that more students are seeking those institutions as places where they will feel welcome, where they will feel supported, and where they won't feel like they are under attack for who they are. And so these two things together, I think we can see HBCUs and minority serving institutions. There's tribal colleges, there's Hispanic serving institutions, there's Asian American and Pacific Islander serving institutions. All of those places that purport to cater to and support students of color from a variety of different ethnicities are probably likely to see more students in the coming years.
So another question in the chat, and I have a feeling you're going to say it's too soon to know, or maybe you hear people talking about this, but the idea that using zip codes could become some kind of proxy for identifying students who come from quote unquote red states, or ones that may be restricting teaching around race and ethnicity or LGBTQ issues or topics. Any suggestion that the zip code is going to become some kind of new super filter?
Wow, that seems, I have to say that seems a bit of a stretch in terms of the second part of your using it as a philosophical or an ideological filter. I think that zip codes are currently used to define recruitment territories. They're used to help institutions bring in learners from broad areas. And so zip codes are absolutely already used in many cases. But to think that an institution might be filtering in that way, I think that presumes that institutions are resourced to do that kind of thing, or inclined to do that kind of thing. It just that feels a little off base.
I would say, I think, zip codes get used in lots of different ways. I mean, certainly when an admissions officer has a relationship with someone at an elite private school that's using a zip code. I mean, you could make that argument that it's already happening in that way. So we're reaching toward the end of the webinar. If the attendees have any other questions, now is the time to throw them into the chat so we don't miss anything. I just want to note some big takeaways. Were there any surprises? I mean, we know that the ruling itself was not a surprise, but were there any surprises, for example, in the dissent or the quality of the, let's say, it wasn't a conversation, but some of the back and forth that happened among the justices and some of the case law that they cited? Were there any surprises for either of you in that ruling?
I had several surprises. I think someone pointed out that the last Supreme Court ruling on race-conscious admissions was like under 20 pages, and this one was 237 pages. So the sheer amount of engagement of the justices on this issue was surprising to me. I wasn't surprised kind of at the end, because we saw from the oral arguments just how much I was actually surprised in the oral arguments from some of the more quote unquote conservative justices, how much they acknowledge the role that race has played in our society and how it still shapes people. I think the fact that they, from then, the oral arguments kept that theme and acknowledged that it is impossible. Like if I were applying to college today to say that my upbringing as a Black woman in the state of Georgia, who knows that her family were slaves and who's like, that grew up in like a, segregated high school, de facto segregation, not de jure segregation, but like that didn't impact me and that I couldn't share that as part of my story would be preposterous. And I think they realized like, there's really no way to like extricate race from American society through college admissions. And the fact that they acknowledge that, again, what that means practically and how institutions actually implement that ability is like way TBD, but I was a little surprised that ended up in the final piece. I was also shocked that they just excluded the military academies with like, no, that was like a complete shock. Like, what the heck? But it undergirded for me, and I think for many others, how much we disagree. And it felt like you don't even agree with yourself about the importance of race as an element of diversity. And you have excluded one with the same argument that these institutions are using as what their rationale is. You have said that is acceptable in this instance and not at the other one. And so I'm a little on edge is probably not the right word, but I'm a little worried about the future of the Supreme Court. And like as another, again, folks looking at it as for its legitimacy with the Dobbs decision, with this on gun, the other decision today on student loans, which again, it has different dynamics, all of these on same-sex marriage and what it means for how people like serve people that have different sexual orientations. Just I'm really concerned with what it means as a whole, like not just in this context, but more broadly when you have pieces like that seem discordant and it feels like you already decided what the result should be and then you contorted your way into it. That is what really shocked me and how blatant that felt in the whole piece.
Yeah, I would say for me, very, very similar. The military institution piece for me was like the biggest surprise because it does seem to contradict everything that they were saying in the beginning. And it feels as though they've pulled the rug out in many cases, but have left us without a floor. And so we're going to have to just very carefully, step by step, try to do it the right way. And I think that it's going to take us some time to figure that out. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to us. And so it's going to take some work to sort that out.
I'm looking forward to the big takeout on the military academies piece of this puzzle. I found that kind of fascinating. Bianca, what about you? Somebody who's watching up the reporter side, any surprises for you?
I think the length of the ruling definitely was a surprise, but also I just think that it was a surprise to me that there's no other moves immediately announced.
Bianca, your unfortunate internet connection is just a little too slow, but how about you throw that into the chat for the group? We apologize for that, Bianca. Thank you. So Camille Phillips had one final question, and that was, what about the messaging here to college students from this ruling? Are there concerns that this decision could actually discourage some people from even considering college, even though we talked about the idea that it's just going to go for these, these high elite schools? For example, a student would think a college doesn't want me, so I'm just not even going to try.
I worry about that. This is why I think in this moment, this is a moment for higher education leaders to be forceful in how they respond and to say, we do want you. We want to redouble our efforts at recruitment. We want to go even further and bigger and bolder in thinking about how we can promote policies that continue to foster a diverse learning environment for all students. So I hope that is the outcome so that you don't see students say, college isn't for me, these places don't want me there.
Yeah, I echo that concern. It's important. And I think that we're seeing that institutions and higher education is becoming more galvanized in their commitment to diversity. And I hope that that really becomes a groundswell and that that message gets to learners, because most of the institutions that I deal with really are looking to create opportunities for all learners. And I think that their commitment to diversity is unwavering. And so I hope that our students hear those messages.
I want to thank you both for making time for EWA and what has to be a very, very busy day. And I imagine next week will be busy as well. A reminder to our attendees, everything was on the record. You will be getting a short emailed survey asking you to let us know how this went for you. Please let us know. It's how we improve the quality of our content and our programming. If you haven't done it already, please subscribe to EWA Radio. Every other week, we talk with a journalist about the backstory to reporting. If there's a reporter you want to meet or hear about, let us know. We look forward to seeing you at our higher education seminar. We'll be announcing details about that soon. It's coming this fall, and we really appreciate everybody's time on a deadline day. Melanie Gottlieb, Zakiya Smith-Ellis, and I'm Emily Richmond for EWA, and of course to our talented moderator, Bianca Kilantan, and we will see you next time. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.